The film opens in 1959. A group of kids are being called in by their teacher after recess, but one girl, Lucinda, stares at the sky, hearing voices in her head. After lunch, the teacher explains that they will be burying a time capsule to be opened up 50 years in the future by kids just like themselves. So they will draw pictures of what they think the future will look like and bury it in the capsule. While all the other children draw pictures, Lucinda is busy writing lines of numbers, but before she can finish, her teacher takes the paper as her time is up. At the time capsule ceremony, Lucinda goes missing and a large manhunt is organized to find her. The teacher goes to the basement of the school, only to find Lucinda with bloody fingers and writings in blood on the door, while she begs for the voices to stop. In the present, John, an astrophysicist, is sending his son, Caleb, off to bed, but Caleb reminds him of the 50th anniversary at his school. Here we find out that Caleb's mother has passed away and John does not believe in heaven, but he allows Caleb to believe that his mother is somewhere better. John then sends Caleb off to bed. The next day is the 50th year anniversary at Caleb's school. The teacher from 50 years ago, Mrs. Taylor, cuts the ribbons and the time capsule is lifted from the ground as the kids look on eagerly. The capsule is opened and the letters and the drawings handed out to the kids. Caleb steps forward and is handed a letter. It is from Lucinda and he opens it to find it filled with numbers. He begins to hear the voices and sees a man in a dark cloak standing a distance off from him, but he disappears. Later, Caleb is doing his homework when John sees the letter with the numbers and Caleb thinks it might be a code, but John thinks nothing of it and sends Caleb off to bed. John is having a drink while watching a documentary when he accidentally spills some. He heads to the kitchen to clean up when he notices the letter with the numbers. He writes out a few on his board and notices a pattern. The first numbers are 9/11, which corresponds with the attacks. The next few numbers correspond with the Oklahoma City bombing and also Hurricane Katrina, which he finds very strange. He realizes that there is a very dark pattern in the set of numbers, all corresponding with mass human casualties, and realizes he stumbled upon something strange. Later, John heads over to MIT to show his friend Ben what he stumbled upon. All the numbers match up to major world disasters in the last 50 years, except the last 3. The next set of numbers indicate that tomorrow, 81 people will die from a disaster. Ben thinks John is crazy for believing a piece of paper, and believes humans find patterns to everything, but John is adamant that something is off and leaves. He heads over to speak with Mrs. Taylor to ask her about Lucinda and the day the capsule was buried. Mrs. Taylor tells John about finding Lucinda in the basement with bloody fingers. John shows the old teacher the letter, but she makes nothing of it. John also learns that Lucinda passed away a few years ago. Later, John is at home inquiring about the capsule when 2 strange men pull up outside. Caleb is outside and begins to hear voices, then runs towards the car. One strange man hands Caleb a black rock, just before John sees him and runs out to get him. John scolds him about talking to strangers and sends him inside. Later, John is looking into Lucinda's passing when his sister, Grace, comes by to visit, and we learn that John does not have a good relationship with his parents. Later that night, John is watching the news when the clock hits 12. He begins surfing through the channels to see any reports of persons perishing, but eventually falls asleep. The next afternoon, John is awakened by a call from Caleb as he is late picking him up. There is a rainstorm and John is stuck in traffic. He steps out to find out what is blocking the road, and at that moment, a massive aircraft tore across the bridge, blowing to pieces in the distance. John runs over to the wreckage as people scream and burn all around him. Later, John heads over to Grace to pick up Caleb, and on the news, we hear that 81 people have died. Hearing the news, Ben rushes over to John, finally believing his friend. Ben warns John to leave it alone as he has a bad feeling about all of this. That night, a strange man stands outside the house and Caleb is awakened by voices. Before him in his room, a tall pale man steps forward, pointing at something. At his windows, Caleb sees a vision of all the trees and animals burning around him. John is awakened by Caleb's scream and rushes to his room to see him curled in a corner. John hushes him and then sees the shadowy figure in the distance. He rushes out of the house to confront the man, shouting to leave his family alone. The next day, John locates Lucinda's daughter and granddaughter. He follows them to the local museum where he strikes up a conversation with the woman, who introduces herself as Diana and her daughter Abby. John reveals the letter and the information to Diana, thinking that her mother may have had some sort of ability to see the future, but Diana gets angry and leaves, warning him to stay away from her. John reveals that 181 people will die in New York tomorrow, but Diana gets her daughter and drives away. That night, John gets himself a gun, thinking that Caleb may be in danger. Outside, more strange men gather around the house in the woods. John checks the coordinates on the next following numbers, which are exactly in New York City. John tries to warn the authorities, but they do not believe him. John brings Caleb to stay with Grace for a few days while things unfold and tells Grace to not let Caleb watch the news. John heads to downtown New York City, to the exact spot of the impending attack, trying to figure out what is going on. He sees a policewoman, asking her why the area hasn't been sealed off, but quickly realizes that they are looking for him, in relation to the call he made. John runs underground into the train station to see it filled with people. He sees a suspicious man, who takes off running frantically. John gives chase. The man boards the train and John corners him, but the police get there also. John thinks he has caught the man, but he turns out to just be selling pirate DVDs. Suddenly, a derailed train comes racing down the tracks. It slams into the platform and train, sending people and debris flying everywhere. Afterwards, John walks out in shock, as dust and sirens fill the air. After picking up Caleb, John heads home to find Diana and Abby waiting for him. Diana confesses that she knew about her mother's ability to predict the future, but never wanted to believe, since her mother predicted that she would die on the last date on the paper. John tells her about how he lost his wife in a fire, which was also one of the dates on the paper, and wonders if he could have saved her life if he knew. The two drive over to Lucinda's childhood home. They find a room with news clippings of major world tragedies, and a page out of a book showing Ezekiel's chariot vision in which the sun is represented. John enters her room and steps on a black rock, looking exactly like the one Caleb got from the strange man. Caleb is awakened by the voices and looks outside to see the car being surrounded by the strange cloaked men. Inside the house, John sees a collection of stones under the bed and lifts the bed to see the words, "Everyone else." Outside, Caleb gets scared and presses the horn, causing John and Diana to rush outside. Caleb tells them that the men were here, and told Abby and himself that they could leave with them if they wanted to. John spots one of the men and grabs his gun and begins to give chase. He sees the man in the clearing, demanding to know what he wants with Caleb. The man turns to him and a bright light begins to shine from his mouth, blinding John. The man then disappears. They head to John's home, where he realizes that the final date has everyone else, written instead of a location, which means this could mean the end of the world for the next event, which is tomorrow. The next morning, John sees Abby color the sun on the picture and he gets an idea. He gets everyone and heads over to the MIT observatory. He heads to Ben's office where he learns that a massive solar flare will strike Earth, wiping out all life on the planet. Ben is shocked, and John thinks that NASA already knows about it and is keeping it a secret. John tells Diana about the disaster and she thinks they can survive by going underground, and John agrees. They head back home to pack up and Caleb begins hearing the whispers, this time even louder. Thinking that his end has come, John sits to look over a few items and a picture of his family. John then decides to finally reach out to his parents and tells his father about the incoming flare, warning him to get as deep underground as possible. His father refuses to leave his home, telling John he is ready to meet his maker at any time. John heads up to get Caleb and finds him writing numbers, seemingly in a trance. John rushes back over to Caleb's school and breaks inside. He rushes to the exact room where Lucinda was found and removes the door which has been painted over. He drives back home, telling Diana that the last coordinates are written in the door, but Diana thinks they are out of time and grabs the kids to leave. John manages to remove the paint and input the coordinates into his GPS, but by that time Diana is already gone with Caleb and Abby. John runs out yelling for his son, and jumps into his truck to search for them. Diana gets to a gas station. An emergency broadcast then begins to play on the televisions inside. The government is warning the people to get underground if possible and to stock up on food and water. Caleb jumps out and is able to call John, telling him where they are. Diana takes the phone and John warns that they need to return to Lucinda's home and follow the numbers, but Diana does not believe him, and thinks only the caves will be able to protect them. At that moment, a car pulled up. Two cloaked men jump into her car and drive off with Caleb and Abby. Diana screams for help. She steals a nearby van and takes off after them. The traffic begins to build up, but as Diana tries to run the light, she is hit by a truck and her car is sent rolling. John reaches the gas station where people are in a panic, robbing the store. John learns from the attendant what way the screaming woman went and gives chase. He gets to the scene of the accident as the sky starts to glow red. In the ambulance nearby, John watches as Diana passes away. John apologizes to her and finds her holding a black rock in her hand. John heads over to Lucinda's home with his gun ready. He sees tracks leading into the woods and follows them until he gets to a clearing. The ground is covered with black rocks. He continues on until he finds the abandoned car, but there is no one inside. John calls for Caleb until he sees a tall, pale man in the distance. John demands his son angrily until Caleb calls out to him. 4 other strange men step out into the clearing. Caleb and Abby tell John that the men have been protecting them all along, and they are the ones who sent the message to Lucinda to help guide them here. Above the men, a massive ship appears, glowing brightly as it descends. Caleb tells John that it's time to go, as the men chose them to help start humanity over. As they approach the ship, one of the men stops them. He tells Caleb that only the chosen must go, and John must be left behind. John gathers his courage and tells Caleb that he must go. Caleb breaks down, not wanting to leave his father behind, but John tells him that they will always be together. Caleb says goodbye and heads towards the ship, and the men shed their human forms and reveal glowing bodies of light resembling angels. They take Caleb and Abby up into their ship, which slowly morphs and lifts into the sky. As the ship rises, we see many other ships rising from Earth. John finally breaks down in tears. He wakes up the next morning at the same spot and heads back into the city. In the city, we see chaotic scenes as people run about screaming and yelling. John heads over to his parents' home where Grace is also. He tells them that Caleb is safe and his father gives him a hug. The family comes in for a hug, as the flare hits, wiping out all life on Earth. On a distant Earth-like planet, we see Caleb and Abby being dropped off by the spaceship. The two run towards a tree, implied to be the tree of life. Remember to turn on notifications, so you can watch more movie recaps like this. Thanks for watching.